From the lowest to the highest, from the furthest to the nearest, from the smallest of the smallest to the greatest of the greatest, yoga is about all of life, everything we do, all of existence. My name's James Bogue. Welcome to the Whole Life Yoga Podcast. Today I would like to speak on the theme of thanking the teachers. And this is the first of what I intend to be a series because I have many, many teachers to thank. And from the point of view of yoga, all of life is about learning. We are here to learn, to grow, to realize and recognize more of who we really are. As Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra defines it, the whole point of the manifest seen existence that we are part of is bhoga, which means enjoyment and education. It's that type of experience that helps us grow, that helps us come to fullness, to ripeness, to the richer, fuller expression of who we really are. And apavarga, which means emancipation, liberation, freedom from our limiting conditionings, from our limiting partial beliefs, those false notions and limiting ideas that enmesh us in delusion. Freedom from all that so we can actually recognize who we really are. So from the point of view of yoga, all of life is about learning. And because we are only alive, we're only experiencing it all because we have consciousness, we are never separate from the capacity to learn, to grow, to recognize, which are implicit and intrinsic capacities of consciousness and conscious experience. Not that we always necessarily harness our capacity to learn, to grow, to recognize, but it's always there. And we can choose to tap into it, and we can practice connecting to that conscious capacity to learn, to grow, to recognize more and more. And that's what yoga helps us to do. And one of the factors that can facilitate that learning, that growing into the fuller recognition of ourselves, is this concept that is sometimes referred to as the guru. Now, guru, like yoga, has 4 letters when it is rendered in English. And like other 4-letter words, sometimes guru and yoga get used rather casually in ways I would suggest that distance us from the true power and import of these amazing terms. Now, guru, many people are aware that guru means a guide, a teacher, somebody who can help us move from a position of relative limitation or darkness to one of relative insight and illumination. This is all true. Guru means teacher, guide, illuminator. Yes, for sure. But before all of those meanings, the primary denotation of the word guru is heavy. Heavy as opposed to laghu, which means light. So guru, heavy, laghu, light. The guru then, as the teacher or the guide, as I understand it, the guru is not just a person who is a great teacher. We may be fortunate in our lives to meet many people who give us heavy-duty teachings. And I always suggest that the guru can be any person, place, experience, the influence of which is heavy-duty enough to shift us from one perspective or state of awareness to a perspective or state of awareness that is vaster, a little bit fuller than the partiality we were previously confined to. So the guru could be some scene that we witness in the street. It could be watching some animal in the sunshine, for example. It could be a person who speaks to us who we've never met before. We could have a chance encounter on public transport, for example. And I have had such encounters. But today, the teacher I would like to thank to begin this series is my class teacher when I was 9 years old, going to my local junior school, as it was called in England, a school I went to between age 7 and 11 or 10 because my birthday was very late in the school year. And my teacher was called Mrs. Eggleston. This was my 3rd year of junior school back in the 1980s. And I'm starting with Mrs. Eggleston because I really think that this particular lesson that she delivered to me and to everybody else in the class. I don't know if it stayed with them in the same way or not, but there was one afternoon of my third year junior school in Mrs. Eggleston's class at Pickering County Junior School, when Mrs. Eggleston delivered what I think is really the most important teaching of all my schooling. And what was that teaching? Well, this was a special day at the junior school for our class, because that day we were lent this particular learning toy, I guess we'd call it, like this equipment. And our class, after lunch, was delivered to the classroom these boxes, and in each box there were these bars and these little metal balls. And the bars, they created rails, they created passageways, and they were of different lengths, and many of the parts were magnetized. Now, this teaching game, this teaching toy, I don't know what else you'd call it really, it was intended to help us learn, I think, about electrical circuits. I think that's what it was intended for. But the lesson that I got that day from Mrs. Eggleston was of a whole other magnitude. Not to say that electrical circuits isn't something useful to learn about, but I don't remember much about what we were supposed to learn from this particular toy. It's what happened that afternoon that had such a lasting import. So we get split up into groups of 4, and that means that every pupil, every student has something to do with all these different pieces. It's a bit like a Lego set, but each box, when we unpack it, there are so many pieces in the set, and they all fit into a particular space in the box. There's an indent groove where each piece fits perfectly. Maybe there are about 20, 30 pieces in each set. And it's all every piece fits perfectly into its little hole, yeah? So we unpack these different bits of equipment, and then we put them together in different configurations, and then we see how the metal ball is able to move around the circuit, or it gets diverted this way or that way. And theoretically we're supposed to learn something about circuits from this. Like I said, I can't remember what we were supposed to learn in terms of the theory or the science of it, but once we've all had fun, it was a special day, getting to play with this, bit like Legos. It was super cool. When we put the things away, so at the end, Mrs. Eggleston, our class teacher, tells us, yes, please put the things back as you found them, then bring them back to the front of the room. We'll all put them here, and then we can give them back to the person who's going to collect them, and then they can take them tomorrow to another school. Anyway, we're all packing up, and every group takes their box back to the front of the room. Except there is a little bit of a problem, because in one box, the lid isn't closing properly. And Mrs. Eggleston notices this, and she lifts the lid to discover that somebody has tried to force an extra piece into that box. Who is responsible for this? Class goes silent. Eventually, one boy speaks up and says, it was me, miss. I'm sorry, I tried to put it in. And Mrs. Eggleston asked the boy, I actually remember the names of the 2 boys involved. They had the same forename. And one of them says, because he told me to, pointing to the boy next to him. And Mrs. Eggleston replies, because he told you to? Is that a good reason? If he told you to jump out of the window, would you do that? No, miss. Well, why did you do this? There's no good reason to try and force an extra piece into this box when we got them, every box had all the pieces required in and no extra ones. No, miss. So why did you do it? Don't know, miss. He told me to. We've already gone over that. Somebody telling you to do something is not a good reason to do it. When I asked you to put all the pieces back in their proper places, there was a good reason I asked you to do that. We were only able to enjoy this learning toy because we received the kits complete. And I think it's only respectful, appropriate, right that we return these kits in the same condition, complete, that we found them. Would you not agree? Oh, yes, miss. Now, somebody telling you to do something, no, everybody listen carefully. That is never a good reason to do anything. You need to always check with your conscience, is this the right thing to do? Now, like I mentioned before, I can't remember what the particular lesson we were supposed to learn that day was in terms of electronic circuits. But this teaching that Mrs. Eggleston delivered stay with me forever. Why am I doing what I am doing? And when somebody tells me to do something, why? What is the underlying motivation? So when I went on to the secondary school a few years later and I did some history studies, one of the things we would sometimes do would be document work, where we'd look at documents from the past and we would look at the language, and that language could perhaps give us clues to the motivations of the people who were writing. For example, when the King of England was executed in the 17th century, we were shown original documents, well, not the originals, but photographs of them, of news reports of the day. And one of the reports talked about king murdered. Another news report talked about how the king had been executed. And the question that our history teacher asked us was, what can you surmise or determine about the motivations of the different people who produced these different pamphlets? Now, there were many other clues in the pamphlets, but we could see that those who suggested that the king had been murdered, the language that they were using was suggesting that they had very different motivations and sympathies than the people who talked about the king who'd been executed. But even then, could we be sure that the people who said the king had been executed, were they really sympathetic to that cause, or were they just fearful that if they didn't display their sympathy, they might be in danger themselves? For example, all this is to say that that day, when I was 9 years old, when Mrs. Eggleston asked that boy, if he told you to jump out of the window, would you do that? It really drove home this lesson. Don't do something just because everybody else is doing it. Don't do something just because somebody who you might perceive to be cleverer or bigger or stronger or more influential than you is doing it. That is not a good reason to do something. The good reason to do something is that it aligns with your heart, your soul, your gut, and your conscience. And many years later, I would suggest this is also a very yogic teaching. The idea is when we act in the appropriate way, our whole system says yes, even if that is very difficult, even if we have to push through tremendous resistance to act like that. When we heed the path of conscience, the system finds at least some spacious ease within that, even if it's a very difficult thing to do. Whereas, if we go against the directives of our conscience, there will be some dissonance, there will be some discord inside. And we will bear the consequences of that. Sooner or later, or sooner and later, the acting against our own conscience will come back to sting us or weigh us down. And so we can tell if we are acting in accord with conscience, because it becomes easier to sleep in peace at the end of every day. And ultimately, the crowning achievement of yoga is that we can die in peace, feeling satisfied, feeling fulfilled, feeling ready. And how will we die in peace? By practicing. By practicing sleeping in peace at the end of every day. And how will we do that? By making each day the expression of our deeper longings and the enactment of our conscience. And this takes practice, of course. But today, I remember, as I often do, with gratitude, Mrs. Eggleston and the fact that I had a teacher like that, because I know I had also, during my school years, I also encountered some so-called grown-ups who would tell school kids to do something, and when questioned why, they would say, because I said so, because that's the way it is, which is a disgustingly inept answer, not worthy of a genuine teacher, in my opinion. But I was very, very fortunate to have some very good teachers during my schooling, including Mrs. Eggleston. But I just feel so grateful that instead of being shepherded into blind obedience and feeling that in order to get on in life I needed to fit myself into some restrictive life-sapping box, instead I had at that very formative stage a teacher who impressed upon me the need to check in with my own conscious resources and with my own conscience. So thank you, Mrs. Eggleston, for this inspiration, and thank you for all of those beautiful teachings of the yoga tradition that remind us again and again that the only way on the very, very broad, very, very inclusive path of yoga is your unique way. The way that is appropriate for you. Just because it works for your neighbor or your friend doesn't mean it's going to be the best thing for you to do. Just because it works for everybody else doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be the best thing for you to do. It may well be, but sometimes on a yogic path we will have to go against in the inertia of the rest of society and against the inertia of the already established habits. Yoga begins when we own and acknowledge that the accrued established habits have not brought us to the place we would really like to be. We're not in the most cohesive, congruent state we could be, and we could do something about it. And one of the things that we could do about it is to start undoing our now self-sabotaging or obsolete habits and replacing them with ones that are more in keeping with the evolving directives of our conscience. But that takes practice, that takes courage. And Mrs. Eggleston that day impressed, I think, on the whole class that in life it's much more important to be honest and courageous than to just go along with the crowd or what the influential person next to you is saying. Another thing that I remember very clearly from Mrs. Eggleston's classes, or that year of schooling, she made it very clear. Just because you don't know does not mean you are stupid or wrong. She said, if you don't know, ask. There was no place for that extra piece in the box, so ask. Not knowing doesn't mean you're stupid. Pretending to know when you don't know, that is stupidity. Because if you own that you do not know, then you give life the chance, and you give yourself the chance to actually learn something you don't know. That's clever. To own when you don't know. And then you give yourself the chance to keep learning. It's such a yogic teaching. So thank you, Mrs. Eggleston. And there will be more episodes on thanking the teachers soon.